Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Northwest Craftsman. You're going to see me all bundled up through this episode, and I may shed a few layers because I just started a fire, but we hit our first cold snap of the season, and so I am bundled up to stay warm while I'm out here doing this video for you guys. Regardless, over the last 2 years of owning my Dewalt 735, I have learned an absolute ton on using it and how to use it effectively. Operation is pretty simple and straightforward, just to throw something through the planer, but to really use it to the top degree or to the best degree, there's a couple of tips and tricks that I've learned over the last couple of years, and I wanted to share with you guys what my top 5 tips and tricks are for using the Dewalt 735. All right, let's get started. Alrighty, so tip number 1, you want to send all of your boards on a final thicknessing pass to finish your dimensioning process. Now, by default, this comes with this ruler or this depth gauge right here, and they do have additions that you can do a digital readout on it to give it a little bit more accuracy. I don't have that upgrade. But one of the things that I found with this particular gauge is that even if you set it as close as you can to an individual height, you're still going to be off by probably a 32nd of an inch or more, depending on how you're doing it. Now, this tolerance stack up may not seem like a lot, but when you're doing additional features on top of it, because dimensioning is your first step, it does kind of throw a wrench in the rest of the project, and I have seen the results of that all the way down through a couple of my projects. So the process that I've put in place is basically get almost all of your boards to exactly the thickness that you need, and then once all of them are there, set it to exactly the depth that you want and run everything through in one final pass or a couple of final passes as you do all of them, one setting, to make sure that everything is exactly the same dimension when it's done. Alrighty, for tip number 2, you want to keep in mind the direction that your grain is flowing in the wood. Now, most wood that you're going to see doesn't have straight grain running all the way down and through. A lot of times you're going to get grain that is coming up and out at an angle because wood is a living thing and it doesn't grow perfectly uniform. So here is one small example of a piece of wood that I planed recently, and it's really difficult to see, difficult to see the grain direction. So I went ahead and I took some pencil and I kind of highlighted the lines, and so you can see that the grain is kind of coming up to the surface here, coming up and out. Now, what you want to keep in mind is that when you're running through this through the planer, you basically have blades that are coming down and scooping a chunk of this material out. Now, if you have something that is sitting loosely like this, if this is your piece of wood and you've got something sitting here, if you have a knife that's coming down and it catches onto that lip, these are all grains and fibers that are running up and in that direction, and so you can catch onto them, and just like a rope, it'll pull them up and out, and that's where you'll get a lot of grain tear out. So instead, if you have it coming in this direction where the blade is coming down here, it basically just pulls on those little tiny grain ropes that are in the wood, and you get a much finer finish. So when I'm laying up cutting boards or anything else that I'm going to go through the planer, that I'm going to run through the planer, I try to make sure that on all of my pieces, the grain direction is roughly unified so that I don't get grain tear out on some pieces and a beautiful finish on others. Alrighty, tip number 3 is that if you've got a big heavy piece of lumber, you're going to want to make sure that you support it all the way through. The in-feed out-feed trays are pretty good at supporting really light pieces of lumber, but even something like a 4x4 when you're trying to run it through there is enough weight when you're first getting it loaded in that you're actually going to sag down on your in-feed tray and then on the way out on your out-feed tray. So what you really ought to do is get yourself one of these nice rolling supports. I'll put a link down in the description, and then you can set that up on the in-feed and the out-feed side so that when it comes through, it is well supported all the way through the motion. All right, step 4 is you want to make sure that you clean and wax the sole of your plane pretty well often, along with the in-feed and out-feed trays. One of the issues that I ran into on a recent project is that I wasn't cleaning it and waxing it on a regular basis, and so I actually had my rough cut lumber sticking to the sole, which causes all manner of different issues on the inside of the planer. So what you want to try and do is, after every major project and periodically after that, go through and clean it off with simple green or some degreaser itself, and then you want to wax it with paste wax, and this will give it a nice slick surface. If you're not quite sure what to do for this, I did post a video right up here, and it goes through all of the maintenance that you should be doing on your planer. Now, that is an in-depth maintenance check for all of it, but that last portion where you do a cleaning and waxing, or one of the portions where you do a cleaning and waxing, is going to be exactly what you're looking to do for this on a halfway regular basis, and that'll keep everything moving nice and smoothly. All right, and last but not least, number 5. The dust extraction by default is set up for either a 4-inch on the outside or a 2.5-inch on the inside. If you want to know what adapters I use to get it to a 2.25-inch, which is really common for most shop vacs, go ahead and check out the links in the description. I have links to all the fittings that I used here. One of the problems that I'm running into though, as this guy ages, I'm not sure if it's because the blower is getting weaker, but I'm getting a lot more chips around the sole and around the planer itself as I'm working with it. Now, that may not be the planer's issue itself, it may be that I'm not using adequate dust extraction. The problem that I have is that my shop vac does not pull enough air fast enough to overcome the blower in here, so I can actually use this without having a negative pressure on the backside because the blower is generally strong enough to run it through my cyclone, filter out everything. It's just that, well, then I lose enough pressure on the inside that I'm leaving chips behind. So one of the upgrades that I'm looking at doing in the near future is upgrading all of my dust collection to include a 4-inch dust collection, which I'm going to use around this because the new dust collector has a higher rate of extraction than my rate of expulsion that's coming from my planer. So the lesson learned that came out of this one is just be aware that you may need to use a 4-inch if you're going to be using this on a regular basis. It may not actually be the planer's fault, but you can get some chips building up around the planer. Well guys, I think it's just getting warm enough by the end of this episode that I don't need to have quite all my layers on. But I hope that you learned a couple of things about using this planer. I have absolutely loved having this thing around the shop, and in fact, it is the first piece of power equipment that I got in my shop, and I am really glad that it was the first piece because it has saved me so much time in dimensioning my lumber. If you have any other things that you've learned over the years that you've been using your planer, I would absolutely love to hear from you guys down below. And not only me, but everybody else that's on the channel, whether you're brand new or been in woodworking for a long time, I am always learning new things from everybody that I'm around. So thank you guys very much for joining me today. Really appreciate it. Glad to be learning along with you, and happy woodworking.